Is the shift to electric vehicles inevitable? Welcome back to Techstination. I'm Fred Fishkin. Inevitable is the title of a newly published book on the subject by Wall Street Journal automotive reporter Mike Colias. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Fred, thanks for having me on.
A pleasure. Well, congratulations on the book, subtitled Inside the Messy, Unstoppable Transition to Electric Vehicles. Give us a bit of an overview here to get started and your motivation for writing this.
Yeah, so I've been covering the car industry out of Detroit now for about 15 years, and I'd say the last 7 or 8 of that, it was just all EVs all the time. That's all any of the auto executives wanted to talk about. That's all we could really write about, and it's a subject of fascination, I think, for a lot of people, and it's become political, and it has gotten messy, right? But I saw this, you know, it's like the biggest disruption, I think. It's not just generational; it's sort of goes back to when cars replaced horses a century ago. I think that's how disruptive this EV transition has been. And so you've got these big existential questions hanging over some of the biggest companies in the world, like General Motors and Ford and Toyota. Are they going to be able to catch up to these newcomers that have kind of burst onto the scene? I mean, Tesla's been around for 20 years, but it's been amazing to watch the ascent of Tesla and how much investors have gravitated to that company. And I think that's really why a lot of the traditional automakers finally were forced to get serious about EVs after a few decades of just dabbling in them. And so there's really, a lot of on the line here, not just for industry, but for society, right? For the way people get around. I mean, I think if you're content to drive a gas engine car for the next 20 years, you're going to be able to do so. They're going to be around for a long time. But for a lot of us, there's going to be decisions to be made about, whether or not we want to use electrons to power the way we get around. So it's just a fascinating sort of story that's unfolding here.
Well, it seems that we in the US and at least some of Europe are in a little different place when it comes to EVs than we were a few years ago. What's your perception?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the EV transition, and it's actually sort of multiple transitions playing out across different parts of the world. So in the US, we're getting a narrow view, right? It's about around 10% of new car sales are either electric or plug-in hybrid. And in Europe, it's more like 20 to 25%. And in China, it's approaching 50%. And so, I think China shows you what's possible when you solve for the two biggest problems that people have and the two hangups that a prospective buyer might have with going EV, and that's price. These are generally a little pricier than the comparable gas power car that you might be choosing from in the showroom. And charging, just people are worried about, will I be able to charge, when, how long is it going to take? China's sort of figured those things out. I mean, the government there has very much put its thumb on the scale to do so. I mean, huge financial incentives for people to buy EVs and for companies to make EVs. And they've got, a big, powerful supply chain, and they control a lot of the minerals that go into the battery. So they have a lot of advantages, and they've really focused on it. But I think that, almost half the people choosing an EV in China kind of shows you, where you can get if you solve those two big pain points. And so the US is probably maybe a decade roughly behind China in this transition.
What are the biggest obstacles here? I mean, obviously there are issues like how many people live in apartment buildings, and I think that may be a bigger issue in some other areas of the world than here, although it's a big enough issue here.
Yeah. So let's just focus on charging for a minute. You'll probably see, more chargers popping up outside your grocery store, maybe, or your, fitness center and stuff like that. And those are great. But really the two problems that need solved the most are home charging and highway charging. Most EV buyers today, which tend to, tilt more toward the affluent side, they have a home with a garage that they could afford $1,000 or 2,000 to put in a charger. They charge overnight. The range on most of the EVs today is between 250 and 350 miles. So you get, in a typical day, you commute, you take your kids to practice, you go run some errands, you've got plenty of juice left, recharge overnight. And a lot of EV owners now, I mean, 80% of charging happens that way at home. And people can get by, you might go a month or two before you have to charge anywhere outside of your house. The road So people who have a home, great. Multifamily condos, apartments, that's a much trickier thing. Maybe you've got a condo where you've got 10 beautiful fast chargers in the in the parking garage. Typically that's not the case, right? And so as you say, I mean, what is it? Probably more than half of urban areas are going to be people in that situation, and so that's a big one. There's a lot of startup companies working on that, trying to figure out the charging in multi-family homes. The other big problem is road trips, and that goes for anybody. And it's not like you can do it in an EV. You just have to plan more and pack your patience, because it's not, you can't just expect an EV charger to be at every exit like we do with gas stations today. And there's, several $billion in federal money going into charging, although President Trump, is looking to claw some of that back, and we could talk more about the Trump effect on EVs. But there's a lot of private sector money going into figuring out charging. It's getting better. It's still in the U.S. many years away from getting enough people comfortable to take the leap.
So today, the Tesla impetus runs throughout your book, of course, but is it now primarily a race, it seems, between Tesla and Chinese companies like BYD? That's reading headlines, it almost seems that way.
Yeah, it's funny. When I started the book a few years ago, Tesla obviously had been the leader and the pioneer and is still the largest EV seller in the world. But the China part of the story has become a much bigger story, just even in the last 2 years. I mean, the speed at which that market has gone from uh, less than 5% of new car sales were EVs, I think pre-pandemic, now to almost 50%. It's really stunning. And the issue now is, so Tesla competes well in China, much better than the traditional automakers, all of which have seen huge market share losses in both gas and electric car. They counted on China as one of their big profit centers and areas of growth for 30 years. And just in the last 3 or 4 years, that's really been wiped away. And a lot of them are pulling out or shrinking in China. But the issue now is the Chinese have an overcapacity of cars, and they're exporting them all over the world, both gas and electric. And so now companies like, if you're Ford and you've already been sort of, beaten into submission in China by the domestic car players there, now they're worried about, Ford's worried about getting beat in places like Europe and Latin America, where a lot of Chinese imports are now showing up. And so, yes, Tesla has to compete against the Chinese in EVs, but it's the same with every other traditional car maker in the world. And the China's rise is really kind of rattling the global car business right now.
Well, in the book, you really do get into the approaches that the traditional car makers, Ford and GM, have taken, and their difficulties in trying to replicate what Tesla has done, I think. So tell us where things stand today. They seem to be leaning into hybrids, and consumers are buying more hybrids, it seems. But pure EV owners, to a pure EV owner, they may think, what's the point? You still have all that maintenance and everything else that goes with having an internal combustion engine in there.
Yeah, so yeah, GM and Ford, and other traditional automakers like them really.
Should put Toyota in there
I mean,
too.
Toyota, yeah, I mean, really all of them. I think they came at this from an internal combustion mindset. So what does that mean? I mean, you can put a big battery and motors and an inverter and all the other guts of an electric car inside a vehicle that had been designed from the beginning as a gas vehicle. It's not going to be as efficient. So it's taken the car companies a while to convince themselves, okay, we're going to do a clean sheet redesign here and make this car electric from the beginning. That there's been some growing pains with that. It hasn't been a smooth transition for them. So they're not getting the cost out. They're still losing billions of dollars on their EV businesses. So if you're Ford or GM, the CEO is sitting there thinking, okay, well, demand is cooled in the US. I rely on the US market for 90% of my profits. Am I going to really lean into this thing that I'm losing billions of dollars on when I make a lot of money on big pickup trucks and SUVs still? And that's kind of the choice they have to make right now. You still, when you talk to these auto executives, yeah, they've delayed some things and slow walked a few investments, but I think they know that they're going to have to compete on EVs with the Chinese and other startup players in the future. I mean, they're on the record as saying we think the future is all electric. So I do think on hybrids, we've seen, they wanted to, I think at one point, the industry thought that they could kind of jump right to EVs and the consumers would follow. I think that got lost in the shuffle. And so I think there's a lot of customers who appreciate, the backup of a gas engine, peace of mind that you're not going to have to, a plug-in hybrid has become pretty popular. It's still a very small part of the market, but these go 40 or 50 miles on fully electric drive, and then they switch over to gas. And I think there's some peace of mind with that. And so I just think we've seen in the last few years, hybrid is going to be a big part of the story and the transition, for probably several years.
The car makers from Korea seem to have pretty much made their choice, made their bets.
Yeah, Korea's been really interesting. Hyundai and Kia, they've been really aggressive across the board. It's hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and electrics. That's a sort that's kind of like the epicenter of battery production and innovation is in Korea, and so I think that's probably played a factor there. But yeah, I mean, if you look at on the U.S. market alone, both Hyundai and Kia have some really stylish, like highly reviewed cars, critically acclaimed, and they're very much part of the mix at this point.
What are your thoughts? You mentioned the new administration before, the impact that the new administration is going to have on the adoption of what you're calling the inevitable EVs.
Yeah, that's right. So I do think it's a headwind. There's no question in the U.S. It's not going to help. I mean, the companies are already losing money now. The Trump administration is talking about taking away EV subsidies. I would say that a lot of the money that he's looking to claw back is going to be harder to do. It's not just up to him. It's going to have to go through Congress. Now, Republican-controlled Congress, the story has gotten political, and so I think there's some of these, some of the congressmen and senators on the Republican side would like nothing more than to dunk on EVs and take back that $7,500 tax credit that's been in place. I think a much bigger question is there's a huge pot of money available for companies that make EV batteries in the U.S. And we've seen more than a dozen huge battery plants going up across the South and the Midwest. So these are red states like Georgia and Tennessee and Kentucky. And that's all part of this Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden administration's big climate package. Trump is on record as saying he wants to get rid of that, but I think he's going to face a lot of resistance, even from Republican lawmakers who did not vote for that bill, because it's now nurturing all of these, tens of thousands of jobs and billions of investments in these red states. So, I think at the end of the day, I think the car makers are kind of tired of the whiplash in policy, in U.S. policy specifically, and they know they just have to make their bet. I mean, there's these investment cycles in automotive last 5 and 10 years, and they can't be reacting to every administration that comes in. They know they have to make EVs in the long run, and I think that they're going to stay on the path regardless of the headwinds from the Trump administration.
And I'm sure you're writing about it probably as we speak here, almost the tariffs and the impact there.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. I'm still hearing from auto executives who are in denial that this is really going to happen because it would be so devastating. I mean, there's really no, there's thousands of part suppliers in the U.S. In addition to the big car makers, everything from big publicly traded tier one suppliers down to 50 employee mom and pops. There's not one of them that's not impacted somehow. Either they have parts shipped up from Mexico that then they finish and put into other parts, and they send directly to the automakers. The car makers ship, I think 3.5 million cars a year in from either Mexico or Canada. And there's really, I mean, the profit margins in the car business aren't very big. It's, single digit percentage. And there's no place for those costs to go, really. I think the companies will absorb as much as they can, and then it's going to get passed on to the consumer. And the back of the envelope math that we've seen some analysts come up with is maybe a $3,000 per car price increase on average from the tariff. So there's a lot of angst right now in the industry over this.
And the goal seems to be to tell the tell all kinds of industries, make everything here? How feasible is that?
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, the administration's also talked about wanting Mexico's help on immigration and and drugs coming in, but yeah, it's also very much let's create manufacturing jobs in the U.S. I mean, we've already seen a little bit of that, but I mean, this would play out, beyond the 4 years of the Trump administration, right? It takes years to set in motion some of these capital investments that you would need to actually build new factories in the U.S. and reroute supply chains. It's a long-term game. The industry has set up its factory footprint and supply chain to span those three countries over the last 30 years because that's been the rules of the game. We've had free trade, and to for that to go away overnight is really wreaking havoc right now in the industry.
How much of a breakthrough is it going to be if Tesla is able to keep its word and come out with the $30,000 model this year by mid-year that they're talking about? And he's talking about FSD really being the huge differentiator, the full self-driving capabilities, because other companies are talking about it, but no one's doing exactly what Tesla is doing.
Yeah, and I think I think a lot of the companies have similar capabilities as Tesla on self-driving technology, just aren't as aggressive in rolling it out to customers. Um, and the $30,000 car, I mean, that is the key right now. If you can get a quality, affordable EV into showrooms and into consumers' hands, but I mean, people are going to respond, and that would be huge for adoption. And all the companies are kind of moving in that direction. It's hard because the batteries are still expensive, and you'll hear all the time about some battery breakthrough that's going to really reduce costs, and it never really seems to pan out. It's just this incremental grind to get costs down, and so I do think, the companies that start to come in at the $30,000 range or below, that could be a real driver of EV adoption. On the full self-drive. So yeah, I think Elon Musk is seeing Tesla more and more as a tech player, an AI bet, a company that's going to bring self-driving to the masses in, Uber-like rideshare fleets, as well as personal autonomous mobility. I mean, I think there's a long way to go there. I think most experts think that's many years away. But it's becoming more of a reality that you can get, from point A to point B without a driver behind the wheel. Waymo, which is owned by Google's parent company, is now in, a handful of cities with paying customers who get in a van and go from place to place with no driver at the wheel. And so it's a reality, but to get to widespread scale, I think it's going to be several years.
When you think about, say, 2025, we're in, my goodness. When you think about 2035 or 2040, some of these target years that have been talked about in the past, when we look at what's coming out of car makers and hitting the roads, what do you think we're going to be seeing?
I think it's going to be a lot of moving down the size and price scale, right? It's right now the way the companies have attacked this market is going really high end because the batteries are so expensive and they needed some price ceiling to play with. And so we've seen a lot of, big pickup trucks and luxury offerings in the EV space. And now they've kind of hit the ceiling in terms of how many of those early adopters are out there, right? And they're getting to more of a pragmatic part of the market who really needs to be convinced that this is going to work for their lifestyle. I'm not quite sure about how this technology's, if I'm gonna take to it. And if you're hesitant and being asked to spend a lot more than you would normally, that's a tough sell. And so I think we're going to see over the next decade more and more mainstream offerings in EVs as the price of batteries come down. What will that 10% in US become? I mean, inevitable in my book means EVs are going to grow, gas is going to shrink. I can put some percentage predictions on it, which has been hazardous in the last 5 years. But I'd say by 2030, I could see 15 to 20% of the market being EVs and plugins, and then by 2035, maybe you're around a third in the U.S. But in China by then, you know, they might not even be selling internal combustion anymore. So we'll have to see. I mean, the competitive landscape here is so interesting, and how it shakes out is really going to determine sort of the winners and losers, I think, going forward.
How much do you think is going to be word of mouth, the growth of this, and knowing people who have EVs? Because my experience has been, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I have a narrow view, but people I talk to with EVs aren't planning to go back to an internal combustion engine.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the inevitability of this is, on the car maker side, they're going to have a lot of reasons that they need to keep down this path. China being probably the biggest one, and regulations that are driving them there. On the consumer side, I think you're right. I mean, that's probably the thing to pay attention to, is the fact that people love these cars. They're quick, they're quiet. You kind of feel like you're driving the future. Not many people go back. Sure, there's probably some who got into it and didn't realize, that they had to go out of town a lot because the road trip thing is still tough, and they might return their car. But Tesla's the highest loyalty in the industry for a reason. And I think word of mouth. I think if you look at what's happened with hybrids over the last 20 years, when the Prius first came out, there was kind of a stigma to driving that car. It was seen as a bit of a nerd mobile just for environmentalists, and now, I mean, the hybrids are ubiquitous. I mean, you go into any showroom and you're going to probably see lots of hybrids that are look just as nice as the car sitting next to it, but it gets a lot better gas mileage, and sometimes it's peppier and fun, more fun to drive. And so, yes, EVs are a different animal because you got to plug it in and it requires habit changes, and it's not the same thing. But I think that normalization effect with EVs comes in over time, especially to your point, when you see friends who have them, you get in them, and experience them. I do think that there's going to be an acceptance, and we already see that more than half of buyers, surveys will show, are at least open to the idea, and younger people are more open than older people to the idea of driving electric.
The book again is Inevitable from Harvard Business Review Press. Mike Colias, thanks for spending time with us.
You bet, Fred. Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it.